Thank you. Good morning. I hope you're all well. Happy Wednesday. I'm very quickly going to get us started on this. Like I said, for anybody that's coming in, these should be off. We have a really unique and singular event that we're having happen today that doesn't happen every day in our school or in any schools. And so we have a school-wide read that we all engaged in over the summer, and we have the actual author here to talk about that read. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity that we all have. So to that end, I want you to be able to put our best foot forward as Lexington High School in terms of respecting the folks that are up here, okay? So that's why I want those devices off, all right, and your attention. And so I appreciate it. We're gonna get started right now and begin this. And so I'm gonna call out one of your fellow students who's gonna introduce Mr. Yu and get us cracking. So Alicia Lee, come on out. Give her a round of applause.
He's the author of Interior Chinatown, the winner of the 2020 National Book Award, and also the novel that we have come together to read as a community here at Lexington High School. While I'll let Ms. St. Lawrence talk more about Mr. Yu and his work, I hope to provide some context of our work with this text and share my enthusiasm about today's conversation. So, as many of you guys know, over the past few weeks, students and teachers alike have been inspired by Interior Chinatown to reflect on the roles they play, discuss relevant issues, and also express their beliefs and experiences through various mediums. For instance, during our iBlock sessions, students wove in threads of Interior Chinatown with reflections of their own identities to create beautiful visual artwork, poetry, and choreography, many of which is available for you to look at and admire in our beautiful display cases. And in my English class, we used Interior Chinatown as a case study in exploring sociology. So through analyzing the novel, we were able to better understand our own roles. But most importantly, Interior Chinatown sparked discussions about race, representation, and identity in our community. These conversations took place both in and out of the classroom, as well as across all departments. So Interior Chinatown really embodies our school-wide effort to diversify our narrative and to give a platform to traditionally marginalized voices in curricula, which was one of the main goals of Lexington in Conversations Text Selection Committee. Now, I myself am a student on the committee, so I was tasked with reading Interior Chinatown way back in April. And at first I was hesitant. I mean, I hadn't read a book for fun in ages. But the moment I picked up Interior Chinatown, I just could not put it down. I was mesmerized by the style, the unique format, the humor, the honesty, and as an Asian American girl, I related to a lot of the issues protagonist Willis Wu faced, being stereotyped, outcast, underrepresented, and feeling this internal conflict between heritage versus assimilation. But there are also moments where I thought, this is new, this is different. And this combination of both mirrors and windows was what really made me gravitate towards the book, along with its unmistakable flair, of course. I can't wait to learn more from Mr. Yu alongside you all today. Thank you so much for coming and for tuning in.
My students are always the loudest, so thank you. And hi to everyone that's watching this from our classrooms. Thanks to the in-person folks too. I want to thank Alicia for that awesome welcome, and for those of you who do not know me, my name is Ms. St. Lawrence, and I've been working with a group of teachers and students like Alicia for the past 5 years on building what has become a biannual speaker series. We've always had two goals for this program. The first is to get our community reading new books that fill gaps in curriculum, and the second is to bring LHS together around a shared learning experience. It's so nice to see all of you in one place, right? Your bottom halves as well, with your cameras on. Anyhow, I speak on behalf of 25 members of our text selection committee when I say that we've been so excited that Interior Chinatown was our first all-school read, and we get the chance to hear from Mr. Yu about his work. Over the years, we've tried a couple of different formats for this daytime portion of our programming, and today I have this distinct 3 student moderators. Mr. Yu is, of course, the author of Interior Chinatown, as well as 3 other books: Third Class Superhero, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, and the short story collection, Sorry, Please, Thank You. He's also written a variety of essays and short stories in publications like The Atlantic and Time Magazine, and he's practiced law, written for television, including shows like Westworld and Lodge 49. Our student interviewers, Arjun Kumar, Indra Nayak, and Leah Barentine, are all 10th grade students who have served on our text selection committee. They're also student leaders and organizers of Diversify Our Narrative LPS, which is committed to including more anti-racist and diverse texts in curricula and creating more inclusivity in our schools. Together, we've worked to plan a conversation with Mr. Yu that's fueled by the questions you all submitted after your iBlocks, and I will be here to keep time and conclude today's conversation. For now, I'm going to stop talking, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Charlie, Arjun, Leah, and Indra.
For joining us today. So, to start, could you give us some context about Interior Chinatown? What's your go-to summary?
Is this on? Yes. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Excited to be here. Go-to summary. It's about a guy who lives in the background. That's basically it. he exists in the show where the story's not about him. And in the course of the book, he tries to see if he can enter the story, and he finds out some surprising things along the way about what he thought he wanted and what it turns out he actually wants.
Mr. Yu, what inspired you to write Interior Chinatown after your previous focus in science fiction writing?
Thanks, Indra. I don't know. I think my parents. I think it was really, my parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and they told me a lot of stories when I was growing up, and I didn't know what to do with them. For a long time, I looked around for kind of the right container or form to tell this story in, and nothing felt quite right, in a way that really unlocked something inside of their experience until I sort of stumbled on this form for it, if that makes sense.
Aside from the overall message and content in the book, the form of this book is particularly unique. The book switches in and out of the screenplay format. What made you decide to write the book in such a way?
Thanks, Arjun. Well, so as I mentioned, I had been working for, at this point, probably over 4 years, and I had written a couple of entire drafts of the book that really didn't work out. One of which was like a series of fairy tales, and the book was boring. I didn't want to read my own book, and that's not a good sign usually. So I didn't want to bore myself, but somehow, somewhere in there, I started working in television as a writer. And it took a little while, but what happened was, one day I was sort of walking my dog, and I heard this voice, and the voice turned out to be the voice of Willis Wu, the main character. And he started talking, and it turned out he was an actor. And once I figured out Willis was an actor, it was sort of a short step from there to start writing it as a screenplay.
Wow, that's incredible. Another unique technique that is used in the book is the use of second person. Why did you choose to switch in and out of second person, and what was the impact on the reader that you intended to draw out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Second person was a little bit, I had a little bit of anxiety about that choice. It's weird, I think. Not a lot of books are written in second person. There are some, but I just didn't know if I could sustain it for a whole book. I didn't know if readers would want to read it for a whole book. So I tried it in first person, actually, and then I tried it in third person, and neither one felt right. And somehow when I put it in second person, everything sort of clicked into place. And I did, honestly, at first it was more of a gut feeling that this sounded right. It felt more immediate. It felt more like it was drawing the reader in. And I think later on, in retrospect, I realized that what it was really doing was my initial impulse in writing the book, which was to insert the reader into the mind of Willis. You know, I figured that there would be some readers who could really identify with Willis and where he is on the margins. And so that would maybe make them feel like this is humanizing their experience. There would be other readers who really can't identify with Willis, maybe. Maybe they just don't understand his perspective. And so it does the same thing for them. You know, in all cases, I feel like what Second Person did for this book was to say, this character who maybe you haven't thought about or who feels ignored is a human with all these thoughts and feelings. And that only came about when that kind of perspective was used.
You previously talked a little bit about how you felt Willis spoke to you, and we received many questions about how your own experiences may have been portrayed in the novel. This book is one which provides a perspective that we don't often see represented in curricula, and this resonated with many students. Have you ever struggled with trying to conform to specific societal standards? Does Willis Wu's character reflect any of your own experiences?
Yeah, I have struggled with it, for sure. You know, I think growing up, I grew up in Southern California, and, you know, sometimes at school, I felt like I didn't fit in. You know, I remember in high school specifically, I used to walk around at lunch and pretend that I had somewhere to go and just keep walking. When I first became a lawyer, I felt like I wasn't a lawyer. I was like, what am I doing here? You know, I felt like I had been led into the building and I wasn't really supposed to be doing that job yet. And when I first started writing, my stories didn't really look like stories. Like I wrote, my very first short story was told as a series of physics problems, which is pretty nerdy and very weird. You know, I had people say like, this is not a story. And so it was the way that, you know, things came out. It was the way that I felt like I wanted to tell the story of these characters. And so I kind of had to keep going with that, but there's definitely a lot of self-doubt and a lot of like questioning of, you know, why can't I just do things more conventionally? But for whatever reason, I sort of pushed through and kept doing things unconventionally.
Thank you for sharing, Mr. Yu. Another one of the complex issues that Interior Chinatown addresses is misrepresentation in the media. Do you have any experiences in which misrepresentation in the media affected your own biases?
I don't know if I have any. Yeah, I have, you know, definitely memories of growing up and watching representations of Asians on TV and film. And I think it's different for your generation, if I can say that. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, you know, and it was very different. It was a very different time. There were, you know, I remember when there were 3 channels, and when we got the 4th channel, which was Fox, it was really exciting. It was like, oh, there's 4 channels now, which is a 33.3% increase of channels. And now there are, you know, I don't even know how many. There's something like 600 scripted shows on TV or something every year. So there's a lot more representation. There's a greater variety of stories being told from different points of view. But back then, honestly, you'd be lucky to see an Asian on TV once a year. Like, it just didn't happen. And so, and when you did see them, it was usually in one of a number of very constrained roles. And I think that had an effect on me growing up. I have to say, I didn't think about it that way as a kid. You know, I'm not sitting there going, oh, look at their Asian representation. But I do think that at some point when as an adult, I look back on it and just really realized that invisibility had done something to me, to never sort of see people like me or people like my parents in these stories that are really important. You know, they're important to the culture, they're important in shaping people's perceptions, especially in areas where there weren't high amounts of Asian Americans, right? I grew up in Southern California where there is a relatively high proportion of Asian Americans, but lots of parts of the country, obviously, don't have that. And so I feel like that that lack of representation, rather than a misrepresentation, was really what shaped me and kind of influenced me writing this book.
Building off of that lack of representation, which you're talking about, Willis Wu, the main character in Interior Chinatown, faces several challenges with his identity through the course of the novel. Do you find yourself reflected in Willis, which you kind of already talked on? And are there any other characters in the book that resemble?
At least it was for me when I was, watching TV, especially when my kids were little. I was trying to write this book, and there's just Law and Order on all the time, and I just feel like, in 1,000 years or whatever, if future archaeologists are looking at our society, they're gonna and they look at like how much Law and Order was on there. I think this was like one of our dominant story forms, which it might be, the police procedural. And I just felt like using something very recognizable that people understand the pattern, understand the structure of an episode of Law and Order, that will ground the reader, because I'm going to try to do something within that pattern. So I want people to feel safe knowing, okay, I think I get the basic idea, and now we're going on this kind of ride. So.
Adding on to that previous question, are any of the experiences of the characters on the true crime show in Interior Chinatown inspired by things that you have personally witnessed while working in Hollywood?
Oh, that's a good question. All of these questions flow so well. A lot of care in designing the order and the questions clearly. So, yes is the short answer. Yes, I'll just say no. I think it's more than yes. One thing I learned about was how much, like, a lot of what on set, after you write an episode, sometimes they let you as the writer go on set and like produce it, and which means standing around a lot and eating snacks. So I got to be kind of a fly on the wall on set, and one thing I realized is there's a lot of waiting. And, well, what is all this waiting about? And it took me a few days, and then I realized the waiting is mostly when they're setting up each shot. And most of what they're doing when they're setting up the shot is actually setting up the lighting of the shot. And so much of what goes into, I guess, the movie magic of it is the lighting. They really control how things look. I mean, you can light, everyone probably knows, you can light, a daytime scene at night, but beyond that, you can make characters look a certain way, you can make the vibe feel a certain way, you can just control so much about lighting. It's really science and it's art, and I think I try to explore that idea, like how much of the scene is framed and controlled in terms of that in the book.
Throughout Interior Chinatown, Willis Wu dreams of becoming Kung Fu Guy. Expanding on your inspiration for the novel, where was the inspiration for this role drawn from? Why did you choose to name the character Kung Fu Guy?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the lack of representation when I was a kid. I think when I was a kid, there was, there's superheroes and there were athletes and cool people, action heroes, comedy people, whatever. There weren't any Asian heroes. There weren't any Asian cool guys when I was growing up. The closest thing was Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee was cool. Like everybody thought Bruce Lee was cool, no matter what race or anything. Like on the playground, you definitely, like people could call me names or whatever, or I could be, feel like an outsider, but nobody would question the coolness of Bruce Lee. I think that had a sort of like, and I don't think I was alone in that. People, I want to say Asian American kids of my generation probably felt like there's this one universal cool Asian person, and that is Bruce Lee. And so for a long time I felt like that was the slot where in Hollywood and in pop culture in the US, Kung Fu was the one cool thing you could sort of hold on to. And so that kind of becomes Willis's North Star, so I sort of built that into the book.
Touching more on the lack of Asian representation in the media, how do you think this book is perceived by the Asian American community, and how do you think it impacted other people of other races' perspective on how Asian Americans are treated and seen?
That's a good question. I don't know how it's perceived. I think I've heard from readers who have said this, that they feel seen, or that it spoke to some part of their parents' or grandparents' experience, and that's great. I've had other people say that they were confused by it. Some of those people are in my family, and so I think that, which is good. Yeah, I think it's good to have a range of reactions. So yeah, what I haven't figured out yet is like if I guess I don't have like a formal writing group or an informal one, but and because of the pandemic, I haven't had the chance to interact with many other writers of sort of my general cohort, and I don't know. I'd be very curious, to get to talk with some of them about, what they thought of it.
Thank you for that answer. Chinatowns exist all across America. When writing Interior Chinatown, was there a specific Chinatown you took inspiration from?
Not really. I think it was a mix of ideas, a little bit of research, and a lot of TV. A lot of the perception of Chinatown and the Hollywood version of this place. And all of that was, I think, fused together to create an imaginary place that is not really supposed to be just a physical place. I think, there is a kind of psychological element to this Chinatown, which is that these characters, especially Willis, feel like they're sort of trapped inside of the perception of Asians in America as being separate. And that's the Chinatown that I was, I think, ultimately trying to construct.
That's really interesting. The final courtroom scene of Interior Chinatown unpacks the roots of racism and reflects on Willis's experiences with racism throughout the book. The scene poses the question, who gets to be an American? An idea which has been heavily discussed in our classrooms. The ending of the book was powerful and left readers thinking about their own role in perpetuating racism. What do you hope people will take away from this book? What about people in the AAPI community specifically?
Yeah, the courtroom scene had a lot of legal stuff in it. Partly, I think it was because, I was a lawyer and I felt like I needed to use my legal education. No, I think also, in the course of doing the research, I learned about a lot of laws, that exist, both federal and state, that existed in the 19th and 20th centuries as sort of the first, appreciable numbers of Asians were in the U.S. And what they did, how they worked to basically create, in part, the situation that the book is dealing with, which is this feeling of Asians as foreigners or unassimilable outsiders. That this wasn't really an accident, that history and the law played into this situation. And so, yes, there's perception from the media, but that perception didn't come out of nowhere and actually was rooted in factors that go back almost 200 years. And so, in one way or another. And so, I felt like this was, I don't want to, this is a weird analogy, but I felt a little bit like it was the veggies, like it was the stuff, like the book was fun, and yes, I wanted to be entertaining, but if nothing else, I hope that it would be useful. Like, that someone would say, well, I didn't spend $16 for nothing, I learned one thing. I learned about this law, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, or, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, that it would have some use to a reader.
just talked a little bit about the historical events that led to the anti-Asian sentiment. I was curious about how you chose which events you wanted to focus on. There was one portion of the book that was like a newsreel, and I was curious as to how you chose what you wanted to focus on and what you wanted to inform readers about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of it comes, honestly from gut feel. Like if any of you have ever written a story or created anything, whether it's fictional or not, create any, anything, any art or writing. I don't always know in the moment why I'm being guided to, like my subconscious is guiding me. So I think the general compass or overall principle, I guess, would be what serves the story at this moment. And so that newsreel in particular is very crucial to Willis's dad's story. He came from Taiwan. This was a significant event in Taiwan's history, the so-called 228 incident and everything that followed. And so to understand the story, it felt like, yes, we have to get into details here. Yes, this may feel like, if you're a reader, I don't know why I'm reading this right now, or, but hopefully the goal is to shape all of it so it feels like it's part of one, connected story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, adding on to Indra's question about what details you decided to add and why, I was wondering what informed the way that you decided to kind of name the characters, because I know for the beginning of the story, Willis was just directed as a generic Asian man, or the roles that he played, but then towards the end his name actually started to be used. So what was the impact that was intended to have on the story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you framed it well. I think Willis in the beginning is his role. He feels like that's who he is. He's internalized the role to such a degree that he doesn't really differentiate that much between himself and what he plays. He feels like that's all he can be, and as Willis goes through different roles in the book, he gets slightly bigger roles where he starts to do well in the system. And what he comes to realize, I think, is that those roles don't necessarily give him any more freedom, And ultimately, no single role will encompass all of who he is. A lot of the roles, and I think a little bit paradoxically, some of the roles actually allow him to be more of who he is. For instance, when he starts to become not just a son, but the kind of adult son who starts to take care of his own father, to really think about his dad in a different way as someone who's vulnerable, someone he cares about, and will have to respect, sort of like the boundaries between father and son, how to care for his father and still allow his father to retain his dignity, in his own, to some degree, his own role as father. How does he negotiate those things as son? Which is to say, the roles, in some ways, are very limiting, but in other ways define who he is. And so he's all of these things, and ultimately, I think, it becomes more comfortable shedding titles and becoming sort of the person that he is, which is Willis.
This is a little like a random question, but I was wondering, do you have a favorite part of the book or a moment that particularly stands out to you or that you enjoyed writing the most?
No, it's not random. I really love the parts with Willis and Phoebe. I love writing them. I don't really love reading any part of the book. I think it's hard. I don't know if anyone feels the same. It's sort of like hearing your own voice on someone's voicemail or something. It never sounds the way you think it's going to. So I don't enjoy necessarily reading parts of the book anymore, but But yeah, writing those parts was fun. I think a lot of those are based off of conversations I've had with my own kids over the years. Some of the best conversations I've had have been with them in their room when they were really little, trying to get them to fall asleep, and they won't go to sleep. And I just have to lie there until they fall asleep, and sometimes I fall asleep first. Yeah, to me those were the most sort of emotional and sort of fun too, because Phoebe lives in this crazy land of like a kid show. And I watched a lot of kid shows when my kids were small.
Expanding on that last question, in your opinion, what was the most difficult or painstaking, per se, after a particular scene or moment to write the novel?
That's a good question. The transitions, some of the transitions between the sections were the most difficult from a process point of view. It was like I had a bunch of bits, big sections of things that sort of made sense on their own, and I had to figure out how to stitch them together to make a novel. And the initial approach was like, well, you just put connective tissue. You put and then what happened, or in conclusion, you just put it's just words, right? And the goal, I think, is to start with the words, but get underneath to the actual connection, to find why these things are trying to live inside the same story. Only when you do that sort of difficult work of saying, oh, these things are connected, here's how they're connected, that I had to figure out for myself. So that was the hardest part.
Bouncing off of that, I think you did a really great job of capturing the nuances of anti-Asian sentiment. Is there a way that you specifically wanted to depict that? I wanted to feel true from the inside, from the perspective, and this is where I would say I most closely identify with Willis, is there's two main parts to it, which is one, Willis feels like he's not important to the story, partly because he's been told that, his job is literally to be generic Asian man, number 3, he's not even number 1 or 2, he's like, so there is a real sense in which Willis has been marginalized, and then part of it is this self-doubt and questioning of whether or not, he's allowed to talk about that, whether or not he has legitimate grounds for being upset or for feeling like this, so I think those two parts are, Willis really has to negotiate how he's going to try to define himself and how much, and also to discover how much maybe he's internalized some of the stereotypes and some of the racism.
Our final question of the day kind of relates to your answer for the previous question, but given the ending of the book, if you had the ability to talk to Willis and give him any advice, what would you say?
Thanks. Wait, advice to Willis? Yeah. Oh. Practice your kung fu. No, I think, I don't know. Advice to Willis, that's a great question. I think, I think it's probably, stealing from his mom to be more, yeah, I don't know if I can do better than mom.
I think that's it for today, everyone. So if you could just give us a round of applause.
Seriously, that was an awesome job. I really appreciate it. Super insightful, awesome questions developed by students. One more round of applause. I think that's sit tight until the bell rings. All of this took an amazing amount of work from a lot of people. There was a student group, there was a group that had students, that had teachers, that helped to work to select, ultimately Interior Chinatown, and then be able to kind of bring this to you and all of the process. So LEF funded this along with Community Ed, Lexington Community Ed. But I really want to thank Samantha St. who has done a ton of work with this. I really want to thank Charles Yu for coming here. And last thing, I just really appreciate you. I thought you did an awesome job and really showed what it's like to be an attentive and respectful audience for this. So give yourselves a round of applause. Okay, so please stay in your seats. The bell's going to ring in a couple of minutes, so chill out, have a conversation. You can pick up that plot point from that Netflix show that you had to drop off before you started here. Thanks again, folks. Stay seated, please, until the bell rings. Thanks.